Hello everyone and welcome to Gurukul Online Learning Network. Today we are covering the topic Introduction to English Debating, and we are going further in depth into the types of motion in debating. I am Aian Adib, and without further ado, let's get into the presentation session. Now, one thing to remember is that motions are very much varied. Motions are what you have to debate on. This is very important because in the end, the motions are what you're trying to prove. As the government, you're trying to prove why the motion presented is correct. And as the opposition, you're trying to prove why the motion presented is incorrect. So, depending on the types of motion, there will be multiple ways to debate on. Now, again, mentioning that the types of motion are much varied in debate, and there are multiple types of motion. So this is going to be a two-part session. Now, the first part is going to cover two types of motion, and the second part will cover three types of motion. Now, do remember that does not mean these five types of motion are the only types of motion in the debate. There will be multiple types of motion that you have to take into account, and after taking it into account, understand how you should be debating on it. Now, so the first type of motion is a motion of policy. Now, what is policy? Policy is something that you're trying to enact. Remember, government policies. Government is constantly trying to enact something in a country, and to do that, they have a policy to follow, and after following that policy, that is how they will enact the progress they want to make. Now, this motion of policy looks somewhat like this house will enact one-child policy, or this house will do this, or this house will provide money to that. Basically, this is a this house will type of motion. So who are this house? This house can be someone who is mentioned in the debate. For example, this could be this house as Bangladesh will enact one-child policy, or this house as India will enact one-child policy. Now, a lot of the times you may see that there is no mentioned person, because once it's mentioned, it becomes a motion of an actor motion or motion of acting, which we will cover later. But right now, this is to remember that sometimes there won't be any kind of actor in the motion. So this is a much more broader motion in which you can take into account who the main stakeholders are going to be. Now, stakeholders, as mentioned before, are people who this motion will affect the most. Now, who will it affect the most? That is for you to identify. Now, here, who could be the actor in the motion? This is a broad motion in which you can take into account. Now, the thought process in this is who needs the one-child policy most? Basically, countries which are overpopulated. Now, China is the most populated country in the world, but they already have a one-child policy, or they have changed it to two-child policy now. But remember, since China already has this, they won't be enacting it again. So who could it be? It could be India, considering the fact that they have a huge population and it's the second most populated country in the world. Or it could be Bangladesh, because it's the densest country in the world, most densely populated country in the world. So, this you can take into account, but you cannot say that this will be in the context of America. Of course, you can say it since it's a debate in the end, but how will you prove it? You need to have very good argumentation to prove it. Now, I won't suggest you to come up and say that America will enact one-child policy, but if you have a good motion, a good argument that will prove it, go ahead and try to do your best. But remember to think which country needs it and which country will be most affected by this one-child policy. And that is how you identify the stakeholders of this debate. Now, how do you debate on this motion? Now, first of all, as both the both the government and the opposition, you need to provide models as to how this will work. Now, the opposition does not necessarily have to provide models how this works, but I will cover that a little bit later. First of all, the government has to provide a model. Now, what is a model? Model is how this policy will be enacted. Again, as mentioned before, government policies aren't enacted overnight. They are at first judged upon, taken votes upon, and then thought of how this will be enacted and what's the budget going into it. Again, you don't need to be as thorough as to provide a budget to what you're going to be doing, but you need to provide a model in which how this will work. For example, you could say that we will start out testing this in a small region of Bangladesh, and then we will expand further, seeing the progress going on in that particular region. Now, depending on this, we will then enact it into the whole country. Now, this is a model. Now, this is just assumptions, but how are you going to do it? That is the step-by-step process into how you will show this model will work. Now, as the government, you have to do this a lot and show your model. But sometimes in debates, there is that the government does not have to provide a model, but the opposition has to provide a model, and there are multiple motions in which that is prevalent. So remember, see what the motion is asking for and then take what you want to do. So here, first of all, the government has to provide a model. And what is a model? I've covered that. Now, you need to show how this model will work. Show them how you will enact it. If it is something regarding money, you need to come in and show where this will first take place or which places you will take into account. For example, recently there has been an increase in the bus fares of Bangladesh. So how did this take into account? If this was efficient, you could have said that we will take into account the companies of the buses and see if they are CNG or oil run. So depending on that, we will make sure the people know that these buses are oil run and these buses are on CNG, and showing that we will enact the 27% increase on the buses that take oil, and the buses that don't take oil and run on CNG will be the ones with the same old fare. So this is how the model will work. But what has happened? In Bangladesh, they just enacted it. Now everyone is taking reins saying that they are oil run, and that is why they are taking bus fare, and this is a messy situation as a whole. But if you can show your model is efficient, that will work too. Again, this could also be a model of international relation. You could show that at first we will go and make a much more better tie with, let's say, China. We will go to China, send our representative, and then speak to them about this issue, and then later on, as we become much more bonded and our bond grows stronger, we will take into account, we will send our prime minister or something to make or finalize the deal. Then take into consideration which countries or states or places the motion is talking about. As mentioned before, you need to find out who the exact stakeholders of the motion are. You need to find out who will be the best affected by this motion and people who won't even be affected by this motion. And remember, as the opposition, you don't always have to give a model, but if you think you can make a much better model and show why your model will be a better model than whatever the other side is saying, do that. Show your model, provide a counter model to that model, and show why your one wins. Or you could just debate on what the normal social norms are. So here, this house will enact one-child policy. So that means the norm is that there is no one-child policy. So you could just debate on why the norm is the better one. So this covers motions of policy. Then comes motions of fact. The example, this house believes that or supports or opposes overtime work. Now, in these motions, these are motions of fact, in which this is a fact that is going on in the motion, going on in the world. Now, this do not provide a model to this. Now, this house believes that if the motion is stated like this house believes that, then it should be this house believes that overtime work is bad or something like that. Typically, it's not just this house believes that overtime work is bad. It is much more framed, but for the sake of example, I'm giving you that. Now, since this is a motion of fact, you cannot provide a model to it. You cannot say that, all right, this is overtime work is bad, so we will just show how overtime work will work, and we will just give them why this happens and how this happens. No, you just need to debate on the basic principles of overtime work. Why overtime work is necessary or why overtime work should not be necessary. Then debate on the current world. What is going on in the world right now? Is it that overtime work is the normal, or is it that overtime work is not the normal? So you need to come up and say that, all right, in the current world, we can see in Japan, a lot of people are dying from overtime work to the point that there is a literal word that describes dying from overtime work. So is this good or bad? If you're supporting it, saying that overtime work is good, you need to come up and say why this overtime work, even if it's killing people in Japan, is not that bad, and it's just the fault of Japan in the end. Or if you're opposing it, you need to come up and say that, all right, this is an example of why it's bad, and there are multiple examples that I can give and prove why overtime work is bad. Again, arguments must not be biased to the point you're coming up and saying that, all right, overtime work is so good that we think this is happening, this companies are much more benefiting from it to the point there's a 90% growth in the company just because there's overtime work. No, it's not true. And you're coming up and saying like, you're spitting facts that are not the social norm. You cannot just come up and say what's not the social norm and say that this is going to work. You need to come up and provide why the social norm that is happening in this country is something that we are debating upon. Why a social norm going on in this world is not required, or why a social norm going on in the world is so required that we need to keep it. Now, you cannot just come up and say that, all right, we are seeing a much bigger growth in Japan due to the fact that there is overtime work. If it is supported by facts, you can indeed say that. But if it's a complete lie and you're just showing that it's happening, you cannot come up and say that. Arguments must not be biased. You need to come up and talk about what the current world is. Again, debating is a sport in which you're trying to win. So make sure you are still slightly biased towards your own arguments. Again, always make sure to link the argument back to the motion. Now, as mentioned, these are the types of motion that are, these two were the types of motion prevalent in the debating circuit, and there are three more that I will talk about. But since you know the type of motion, you need to come up and show why your argument is so important to the debate. Now, in motions of policy, you need to come up and show why your policy is important to this debate and why your policy will solve what the motion is trying to prove. In motions of facts, you need to come up and show why the fact that you're providing and the social norm that you're trying to fight for is more important and much more better than whatever the other side is talking about. Link your arguments such that it follows the guidelines of the motion and it follows why it should be important to the motion as a whole. Now, what have we learned so far? We have learned two types of motion. The motion of policy, in which the House may talk about what the policy they are going to enact and what are the intricacies to it. You need to prove that. Second, motions of fact. Something that is happening in the current world and this House either supports it, believes it, or does not believe in it, or opposes it. And after that, you need to show that why the norm you're trying to fight for is important and why the facts that you're proving and the norm that you're providing is more important to whatever you're trying to prove. Again, remember the pointers mentioned in the debate, and remember to tackle the motions as smartly as you can and to the best of the ability that you can. There will be a second session on the other three types of motion, and we will talk about them much more in depth. For now, thank you for watching. Make sure to share this video if you liked it, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comment box below.